I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-creating curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Welcome to the Time for Teachership podcast. This is episode 193. And in this one, we're talking about anti-racist co-constructed assessment ecologies. So I am a little late to the game with Dr. Asao Inoi's work. And specifically, I have been diving into his book, Antiracist Writing Assessment Ecologies, and it is profoundly interesting. So we're going to dive into it, specifically thinking about, through the lens in this leadership series of shared leadership and what that looks like inside of a classroom and what it looks like to co-construct things that are as important as assessment and inviting student voice and co-creation in that. Really, really excited about it. And also just to think about, this goal that is underlying all the things we talk about on the podcast, right? Disrupting the hegemonic power, right? Where there's a lot of white, patriarchal, cis hetero power that exists in classroom dynamics that is steeped in education, right? There's the teacher-student dynamic. There's all sorts of power. And so how do we disrupt it? And what are the practices, as well as kind of keeping that goal in mind? And Dr. Inoi's work really does this well and gives us some food for thought. So let's dive in. First, I want to take a look at the research. So the research that Dr. Inoi cites in the book tell us a couple of things, three big ones, and I'll go through each of them. One, grades are inherently flawed. Two, the standards we assess on are often racist. And three, students learn better without grades. So let's look at the research on each. Grades are inherently flawed. So in 1961, researchers French, Carlton, and Diedrich conducted a factor analysis study. So they gave 300 papers a grade. They had 53 graders, and each of the 300 papers were given a grade on a scale from 1 to 9. All the grades are given, all the papers are graded. They take a look. About a third of the papers, 101 papers, received every single grade. The same paper got a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, all the way through 9. A third of the papers received every single grade. That is bananas. All but 6%, so 94% of the papers received at least 7 of the 9 grades. And 100% of the papers had 5 or more, had at least 5 grades. The study concluded that agreement among the graders could only predict, because this was a factor analysis study, only predict 9.6% of the variance in grades. So in short, what this means is the system of grading was not reliable, right, in the study. And clearly, if it's not reliable, it is not fair, right? If the student writes something that someone grades as a 9 and someone else grades as a 1, someone else grades as a 5, right? It's just not a system that we should be relying on. And we can do things, certainly, to mitigate that bias, that multiple perspectives that the graders bring in. And we can do some norming and things like that, I think are certainly helpful, but it is something that we have to keep in mind. The process of grading inherently is not great. Though we are in a system that requires grades for schools and children who are going from elementary to middle school to high school, and high school to college, and other spaces where grades are valued. And so if we are to be working within the system, right, Dr. Inoi is writing from the perspective of a college professor. And so I want to think through these things through a K-12 lens today. Next point, standards are often very racist. And so when we try to assess, even if we're assessing equitably, right, we're using maybe Feldman's work, which I love, using tools like standards-based rubrics, right? We are measuring the standards that are still coming from, in Dr. Inoi's language, a white racial habitus. And so he specifically writes about the writing class that he teaches and assessing writing specifically. He writes, quote, "Conventional writing assessment practices rarely, if ever, dismantle the racism in our classrooms and schools because they do not address whiteness in the dominant discourse as hegemonic and students' relationship to it," end quote.
One piece of this is grammar, even if it's not in the rubric, but people will assess grammar. They will assess ways of speaking, the standard dominant form of English, right? Which is part of a white racial habitus. When we assess in this way, they're saying these other ways of communicating, these other phrases or grammatical schemes are like less valid or not valid here. For me, separating out the grammar pieces from is the writing effectively communicating, that is one kind of step in the process. I have seen and been in sessions with teachers who have assessed something where grammar is not even in, like nothing about even conventions of written English are part of the rubric, and they're still assessing with it. So we have to kind of divorce our minds from like, what are we really doing here? And is the goal, for me, the goal is usually like, is it communicated effectively? Dr. Noy also writes the quote, cognitive capacity is the ability to think rationally, logically, and objectively with rigor, clarity, and consistency that is valued most. So the idea of being able to be hyper rational, doing, for example, one thing I've really started to unlearn myself is claim, evidence, reasoning. We teach it, and it is good to be able to have a stance and back it up with evidence. Evidence is important. And in times fraught with conflict, even with adults in our society, I think it's really important that we learn to seek to understand, or that we might have kind of this convoluted route to understanding, and it's not always linear. And I think this idea of the head and the heart both being critically important as social scientists, as humans, right? When we're teaching things like history class, I personally have realized I don't always want to be in a society or around humans who are only rational and logical, who only think there is an objective truth, because there's always marginalized perspectives. They're missing a complete component, the heart component of the work. We live in that intellectualizing space, and that often inhibits us from feeling discomfort, which is necessary for change and growth and transformation of society and structure. So I do think, right, this idea of the white racial habitus informs things like grammar, informs things like rationality being supreme above emotionality, divorcing the head from the heart. Like these are just things that we see in standards and what we prioritize and what we measure. So recognizing that going into this conversation, I think is really critical.
Hi, this is Leah popping in to share the freebie for this episode, which is a workshop handout titled Labor-Based Grading Contracts. You can find it at the blog post for this episode, www.elizabethlyons.com/193. Now back to the show.
The third piece, students learn better without grades. So Cohn in 1999 did a study that found that students learn more when they are asked to reflect and self-assess on their work, but they are not graded. So Dr. Inouye summarizes this study's findings in his book, writing that students who are, quote, led to think mostly about how well they are doing, or even worse, how well they are doing compared to everyone else, are less likely to do well, end quote. So this idea of how well am I doing? Where am I in the ranking? How's everyone, like, am I normal, right? Like this constant comparison, which given social media and just the culture that kids are raised in is already hyper present in their awarenesses and engagement with the world. I think this is probably, the study was done pre, social media as it is now, 1999. So just imagine, right, 25 years later, how more kind of intense that might actually be in a study. I'm not familiar with more recent research, but I bet it's out there. So again, when students are given space to reflect and self-assess, great. That's actually really good. But the grade component and that comparative, or like getting some sort of like label placed on where they're doing, how well they're doing, that's actually not helpful. That's really important kind of going into this, that we want to distinguish feedback versus grades, right? Assessment can be many things. It can be feedback, it can be grades. We truly benefit from the feedback and the self-reflection and all of those practices, not from the grade itself. And I get that we might need to report it somewhere, but how can we internally within classrooms, within our interactions with students, do the former and not the latter? Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about what this actually looks like. So the first thing we can do is interrogate your beliefs about grades. What should be graded and what shouldn't? Another piece here is determine what your students believe about grades. So interrogate both yours and invite the conversation about what your students believe. What is fair? What is not fair? Joe Feldman's work on clarity, not having that hidden path to success that some students who are typical A students, it might be partly how they've learned, but they've also had access to institutions or preparation in some way that enables them to be successful, whereas other students don't, right? So again, thinking through the lens of equity, we really need to do some unlearning. Dr. Noy talks about how, quote, tensions in the assessment ecology, a product of its politics, often come from an uncritical use of a dominant discourse in judging and assessing student writing. He goes on to talk about how when we co-create with students, and then we can actually see that as like participating in the counter-hegemonic. By co-creating with students, by pushing back on maybe what we traditionally think should be graded, we actually can disrupt the hegemony present in classrooms. I think that's a pretty cool idea. There's a lot of things, though, again, that we might have to let go of in order to arrive there. The next part is, where can you test ideas? Figure out where you might be able to do a little testing, a little piloting, figure out what's in your locus of control. So you still may need to convert A through F to report cards to report out. Totally understandable. And like, what do you do though to get that, right? What is the conversion, but like, what's the system you use internally? And I think part of that is figuring out, right? Like Dr. Noy writes about the 7 elements of anti-racist writing assessment ecologies. And so he talks about one being power, right? And so needing us to interrogate it, a little bit of what I talked about in the first bullet point here. And then next is like the parts, right? The parts of the system, the artifacts, the codes, the judgments made by people. So a portfolio, for example, is kind of like a part. That's a part that we grade. And when we have the grade as a part, it's going to change students' attitudes, right? It's going to change how students respond to a particular assignment. And it's going to change the whole nature of things, right? And so if we can't get away from grades, how do we get close enough to away from grades that we're centralizing the feedback over the grade itself? The third element of the ecology is purpose. What is the purpose of being here, of writing, of assessing? We're not doing this for a grade. We're doing this because assessment is actually like really what's going to help you grow. Fourth is people, and all people have different powers. So again, you can see some of these intersect, right? Power and people are 2 different elements. Processes. So again, like inviting reflection, awesome. And we want to make sure that that reflection process is not informed or dominated by kind of that white racial habit as he talked about. 6 are products. So here he talks about direct and indirect consequences. So direct product would be like the score, the grade, the decision, the way that the teacher or the peer gives you feedback. And an indirect is a result of the direct thing. So you get feedback that talked about how you should change your grammar. And so now your focus is on superficial editing, right? You got a D grade. And so now you think you're not a great student, and that's going to inform your future performance. And your identity is like, I'm not a writer, I'm not a good student, right? So we have products that are direct and indirect as the result of the direct. And then finally, the 7th element is place. And so this is rhetorical and material conditions in the production of judgment. So this might be a discussion board, because that's where the judgment or the assessment or the feedback precisely is taking place. It might be a rubric. This is a material condition. It's a thing that we interact with to offer that feedback, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a student. It might be student-to-student writing groups. Place is where we can make the hegemonic visible in Dobrin's words. And so we are able to kind of name the thing in the space. And again, all of these elements interact with each other. So how people are interacting with these material conditions, the rubric within the writing group, how power is conveyed there, like all of those pieces are really important. And of course, to do this well, right, we really need to be thoughtful about the community involved. Step 3, what I would say after you've interrogated your own beliefs and determined where you might be able to test out some ideas, maybe playing with one of those elements of the ecology, we want to make sure that we have laid the foundation that invites a perception of safety, that enables us to grow and learn and make mistakes and be uncomfortable, and that values feedback. So I think all of those things are kind of foundational to inviting co-construction. I also want to say that students may find it difficult to co-construct because they are not used to co-constructing. It is hard for students to come in and tell you what they want, partly because the older they are, the more they've been kind of indoctrinated into this is how we do school. Just tell me, or I know how it works. We're not going to do this other thing. I've lost my kind of creative spark because school has taken it from me, right? In all of its rigidity of the system. But also that when we invite student co-construction, there's a power dynamic there. And this is one of Feldman's responses to Inouye's work, is that when you invite that co-construction, you can't ignore the power dynamics that are at play here, and the societal pieces that we have just been consistently told, like, this is academic English, right? This is the way that things are graded. This is the way. And so it's really hard to disrupt that. And I think we do our best to, but I do believe in that invitation of co-construction with students. And so a couple things that you might be able to play with here in terms of, what you actually move forward with in terms of like a thing to do. So once you've invited student co-construction, I think step 4 is really going to be, what do you do now? Like, what are the things you put some things into play, create the contract or developing the rubric together, whatever it is that you are creating, create the product. And that could be, for example, dimension-based rubrics. It's something that I really gravitate to as I think a beautiful blend of what Feldman talks about and what Inouye talks about, because yes, you're still kind of speaking to the standard at large, but it is way more flexible. And I really like that. So that flexibility piece is critical, I think, to being able to not bring in all of the pieces that we bring in when we use the specific standard language. So that's one piece that's really, really cool. And then another, I think, that labor-based component of a grade where Dr. Inouye grades his students based on how many hours of labor they put in, and then they track that. That's a really cool piece to play with. And so perhaps using that as one line of the rubric. I know when I was a teacher, we often had a percentage, 85% were academic standards and 15% were process standards, or we call them work habits. But I think about the way in which we labor, they could be labor-based standards or something. And maybe that is co-constructed with students to determine what the language is. So I think that could be super cool. And then finally, a last practice, once you've kind of created the contract, the rubric, whatever the kind of material product is, step 5 is really thinking about the ways that you embed and normalize reflection and self-assessment into your classroom practice. So put it right in the schedule, right? Every Friday is student self-reflection. We are going to use this protocol for peer feedback. So we're going to have all of the students use peer review, for example, where they look at the rubric and they annotate the rubric so that they could give feedback on a fellow student's piece of work, very specifically and precisely related to how they'll get the assessed grade from the teacher. They're just kind of normalizing use of all of these pieces so that it's not, we invite student co-construction and then we do nothing with it, right? We actually co-create something that is a kind of living document or rubric or whatever it is, contract in the class. And then we use it regularly. Every week there's a protocol that involves us using it and self-reflecting. And maybe not even giving grades, right? Maybe just using that rubric, that narrative feedback, qualitative feedback from peers and teachers and self, and then the grade comes later, right? Now, this was a massive kind of episode with lots of research and lots of heavy kind of unlearning and big ideas. I want to say it is a massive undertaking, and I just encourage you to kind of try one piece, one little piece to start. And I will link in the show notes a beautiful kind of summary of Dr. Inouye's work. After listening to a podcast, I was led to someone's website that had this on there, and it is so incredibly helpful.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.